Now that we've learned the proper overhead position, we're going to learn a movement today called the push press, which is how we can use our legs and hips to add power into getting the bar overhead. The Olympic lifts are all about using our lower body to help power the bar overhead, where we finish with the upper body. So the push press is the first step in learning how to do that. With the push press, we want to find a very jumpy stance or starting position with our feet. So go ahead and do a few hops in place to find where your feet feel the most powerful. You will obviously find that if you're in a wider stance, you're not going to be as powerful. Usually feet are going to start somewhere around hip to shoulder width apart. Now that we've found our stance, we're going to practice a move called the dip and drive. In the dip, we are going to bend our hips and our knees so that we're loading our legs like we're ready to jump. So imagine doing a high jump, how you would load your feet as you're dipping down. Now in the dip, it is important to know that our torso should not dive forward. We want to keep the overall trajectory of the bar going straight. So our torso, from a side view, will go straight down and straight up in the dip and drive. Lastly, one thing to note in the dip and drive is whether or not your knees are going in or if they are tracking straight out over your toes. You want to make sure that your knees aren't valgusing inwards or coming inwards as you're dipping, which means that your hips are just probably not quite strong enough yet to support that load of your legs. Over time, you will develop that hip strength. So you want to dip with the knees tracking out over the toes before you drive. Now you'll notice as you dip and drive that bar naturally wants to pop off the back of your shoulders because of the power of the legs pressing and pushing into the floor. We're going to use that momentum to drive the bar overhead and lock out that overhead position aggressively. So we're going to dip, find the load even through the feet, 50-50 ball of foot and heel, so not too much on the ball of foot, not too much on the heel. You want to feel fairly even, dipping just a couple of inches. It's not too deep. And then we're going to drive and find that overhead lockout position aggressively. You want to punch, lock out those elbows, straighten those arms as soon as you can. So let's practice 5 to 10 dip and drives. Dip 2 inches and then drive, punch overhead and reset. Dip and drive, punch overhead and reset. The more that you can practice being feisty and aggressive with your arms at lockout, the more you're going to build that muscle memory to be able to receive the bar aggressively overhead. Now that we've learned the push press, we are now going to learn a slightly more complex version called the push jerk. In the push press, we are continuously straightening the legs until our arms lock out. In the push jerk, now we are going to re-dip and punch the arms out so they lock out sooner as we receive the bar. So next we're going to talk about punching and landing our hands and feet at the same time. When we receive the snatch, our hands and feet will punch and land simultaneously at the same time, which means our arms lock out while our feet hit the ground like you're punching 2 buttons overhead, 2 buttons below your feet at the same time. In the push jerk, think of it as a jump and a punch. So we're going to dip with the legs, we're going to drive, and we're going to punch both hands and feet at the same time. So this time we're going to dip, drive, and punch. As you land, notice that the legs, the hips, and the knees are re-bent and re-dipping. So I come from a bent position, hips back, knees bent. I'm going to drive straight up, extending the hips and the knees straight. And then I'm going to re-land the feet. I'm going to listen for my feet in the catch. You want to make sure you don't land with soft feet because then your foundation will not be as firm or as aggressive against the floor in order to receive a heavy load. So we're dipping, we're extending, we're punching the feet underneath the bar. You'll notice in the push jerk that your feet may actually move slightly outwards from your starting position to your finishing position, which is totally fine. It means that your feet are finding a wide area of base in order to support going into the squat if you were to catch it later in a snatch going into a squat. The reason why we send our hips back as we catch in the snatch is to prepare ourselves to go down for a squat if we eventually work up to that point in the snatch. Also, sending the hips back as you catch it will allow your weight to be even and balanced as you receive the bar, And then we'll also take load off the back. If you catch with the hips forward, so make sure you're not catching with the hips forward, because then the load's gonna go right through the back, and then you're gonna really feel it later on through your knees and throughout your whole body once that load gets heavier. A few key points to remember as you are doing the push jerk. First one is the dip is very shallow. It is not as deep as you think. You want to dip just enough to feel that load through the legs, and think about it as a 2-inch dip, just finding a crease in the hips and knees before you drive and punch. Second thing is making sure you're keeping that torso straight up and down. It's not leaning forward or it's not going back as you're going into the dip. So you're keeping your shoulders stacked right over the hips in that dip and drive, and you're aiming to stack everything as you are receiving that bar. It's totally fine if this is taking you a bit to get used to the movement of the push jerk. In fact, you may find the push press to be a lot easier at the start and eventually become more comfortable learning the push jerk, dip, drive, punch as you are working into it. So give yourself some time to learn it. Don't worry if you feel like it's taking you a bit to get used to the movement. It will come with practice and with repetition.